courage does not need the crutches of power, and that oppression cannot suppress the will of the truly awakened. Today, his legacy is inspiring a new breed of Indians whose strength, vision, and idealism is changing the face of India. Saluting this new Indian, the New Indian Express. It's new, it's Indian, it's Express.
Welcome back to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival protected by Detol. Our session now is Smellosophy, the Mind and Body Connect. A.S. Barwich in conversation with Ambarish Satwik. A.S. Barwich has spent a decade researching the way in which the brain works in response to external stimuli. Her work is now focused on how and what the sense of smell communicates. In her book, Smellosophy, What the Nose Tells the Mind, she examines the reception in the brain to information carried by the nose and has found that the sense of smell does not function in the same way as the other senses would lead us to expect. She looks beyond the paradigm of vision to examine the mysteries of olfaction. In conversation is the multi-dimensional Ambarish Satwik, a vascular surgeon and professor who's also written the critically acclaimed Perineum, Nether Parts of the Empire. Together, they discuss the interface of body and mind and the puzzles of smellosophy. A.S. Barwich is a cognitive scientist and empirical philosopher. She's assistant professor at Indiana University Bloomington. Her research specializes in olfaction as a new model for theories of perception and cognition and the conceptual foundations of neuroscience. Ambarish Satwik is a vascular and endovascular surgeon and writer. He's director of the Vascular Cath Lab at Sir Ganga Ram Hospital, New Delhi, and professor of vascular surgery at the Ganga Ram Institute for Postgraduate Medical Education and Research. He's the author of the critically acclaimed novel, Perineum, Nether Parts of the Empire. Please do remember to comment by typing it in the comment section. Ladies and gentlemen, Smellosophy, the Mind and Body Connect. A.S. Barwich in conversation with Ambarish Satwik.
Thank you. Delighted to be here, though not slightly, but cripplingly embarrassed to be the interlocutor with such an accomplished person. You know, and you've been described as a cognitive scientist, an empirical philosopher, and historian of science and technology and the senses. You know, that is perhaps the most triumphantly exciting combination of occupational descriptors I've heard ever in my life. You know, you must have gotten used to all the adulation of all the people around you. This is remarkable. I mean, this is anyway. So we will move on to this very fine and almost staggeringly fabulous treatise on olfaction that you've written, which is Smellosophy, What the Nose Tells the Mind. And I'm going to kick off by asking you to give us the executive summary on what Smellosophy is all about. Anne?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me and also for this super kind introduction. Smellosophy is really the quest about what can we actually know about the mind and the brain, and especially how the brain creates the mind through possibly the most unlikeliest model system, namely smell. People don't associate smell with the mind that much. We associate smell with instinct, with behavior, with other animals, but we don't think about cognition and the brain much. And I often wonder to what extent the way we think about certain cognitive faculties, the mind, is influenced by our focus on specific model systems. And we often just talk about vision in that context. And I wonder, what can we understand about smell about the mind through smell? And that was the driving question. And then I stumbled into this field and realized, first of all, there are lots of puzzles. And it turns out we are currently undergoing a revolution when it comes to the science of smell, because people have been over the last 10 to 30 years they noticed that smell actually works different than vision. It works different than audition and the somatosensory system. And these differences might tell us new things, and they might help us to develop new questions. So in effect, this is a book about questions, actually. How shall we ask better questions about mind and brain?
Mm. And I think one of the remarkable markers of a book, of the successful book, is if it ends up asking more questions than it provides answers for. So Anne, tell us what exactly is happening when we're smelling.
So the short story is that when we're smelling, you've got airborne molecules, volatile molecules traveling up your nose, the nasal cavity, up to a cell layer called the epithelium, and that hosts the receptors that really directly interact with these airborne chemicals. And that's a wonderful interaction because, first of all, you've got several hundreds of these receptors in humans, about 400, 1,000 in mice, 2,000 in elephants. So this is a vast variety of different receptors. In comparison, vision only has 3 color receptors plus the rods. And that interaction results in a signal that leads directly into the brain. And the olfactory pathway is rather shallow when it comes to stages. So you've got the interaction at the receptors. Then this signal is transmitted directly to the bulb, to the olfactory bulb, which is an area at the frontal lobe of your brain. And from there, it goes to a variety of areas, but mainly the olfactory cortex, the so-called piriform cortex, which is the largest area of the olfactory primary cortex. And it's called piriform because it's kind of shaped like a piriform, and I quite like that term. But the signal also connects to the amygdala, which is involved in affect, as well as, for instance, the orbitofrontal cortex involved in decision-making. And what is so fascinating about smell is this looks rather simple, right? You've got 2 synapses straight from the air to the brain into the deep cortex. In comparison, in vision, 2 synapses don't even get you out of the retina. So that looks like this should be an easy system to crack. Well, the more interesting questions, why haven't we understood fully how we smell? And the simplicity, this deceptive simplicity of the system was already mentioned by Ramon y Cajal, who at the turn of the 20th century actually said we should look at smell, because what we're seeing here is this beautiful system. What other system can tell us how the signal makes sense of, how the brain makes sense of external signals? Well, it turns out, of course, like with many things, as soon as you've got a simple system or a simple question, it leads you into Pandora's box. More and more complications and difficulties arise because the devil is in the details. And with smell, these details are precisely what I wanted to explore in the book. One is, of course, the interaction at the receptors. We still don't have a stimulus response model, meaning there is no way in which we can predict the quality of a smell, the kind of sensory quality from the molecular structure. And that was often kind of referred to, well, that's because smell is subjective, and there's just too going on up. It turns out, no, we just modeled the system wrongly. We shouldn't start with the chemicals independently of the organism, of how we're perceiving, but we need to look at how the receptors interact. And it turns out the receptors are quite complicated because they're acombinatorial. They detect different bits of different molecules, and one molecule can detect different, can be detected by different receptors. And here the most interesting part, why I do think that biology tells us much more about how we perceive than just psychology or psychology independently of biology, because it turns out that this is the heterogeneous family. Like you've got this variety of receptors as 400 in humans, but also every person has an individual receptor expression in their nose. So we do perceive the world differently because we are genetically heterogeneous. And also you and I have some receptors expressed, some receptors not expressed, some we will share, some we will not share. So the same molecule can smell different to us. And there were recent studies, 2019, but also some earlier studies showing that the genetic diversity of humans is actually also reflected on the perceptual divergences, that some smells you perceive a couple of things a bit more strongly than I do, or some notes are a bit more prominent for you than I do. And these are the questions I find extremely interesting, because what does that tell us about philosophically, the relation between objectivity and subjectivity. How do we perceive the world? And how do we speak about the reality of the world through our senses if we get a better sense of the biology?
So, traditionally, it's been always termed the supplemental sense, the auxiliary sense, and not the primary sense. And therefore, it's been a sort of under-theorized distal sense, so to speak. And you've always had, through your book, you've had this, you've said that this is a narrow, uncharitable view of olfaction. And you seem to suggest that it is one of our primary distal senses. So can you explain how you might want to kind of buttress your theory that this is a primary distal sense and not just a supplemental sense?
One thing is that we associate the distal senses with objects we can grasp, we can walk towards, while with smell we often have this feeling. We often just think when we perceive something, it's just an expression of our consciousness. But that's kind of a minimalist view. A lot of the things we react to in the external world is actually a measure of the chemical environment, which is important for an organism because certain molecules, certain smells, certain mixtures in a high enough concentration can kill you. So you better know what it is, where it's coming from, how to avoid it, how to approach it. And I often just use bacon as my example in terms of, well, it makes your head turn and you're trying to, if there's a good food smell, you're trying to figure out where it comes from. And just because we often are not as precise with olfaction when it comes to knowing where it is, doesn't mean it's not a distal sense. The reason why it's not seemingly as precise as vision is because the stimulus itself is unpredictable. As a chemical, you've got it in the airflow, it's constantly floating around, you've got hundreds of molecules surrounding you. So it's no good for your brain to know precisely where one molecule is in your surroundings. It just has to be good enough to follow it. Also, it's not just simply that we are not good at it, but mainly we have to be aware of it and we have to train ourselves to do it. So in our day-to-day lives, we don't have the need to necessarily figure out where things are. I mean, I know the coffee smell in my house comes from the kitchen, and I know where the kitchen is. But if you're outside, you have to first orient yourself until you find the source. And people who need smell more, for instance, in their profession, whether or also in their daily lives, they are extremely good at locating smell. And you can even see psychological studies such as Jacobs at Berkeley, who did a test where she blindfolded people, turned them around so that they were disoriented. They could find the source of an odor just by smelling. So it's not that we're not good at these kind of things with smell. We just don't often know about them. And also we don't recognize them as olfactory. We are guided a lot by our nose to find something, to approach or avoid something without necessarily evaluating consciously as, okay, I'm following a smell.
Mm. So in terms of food and libation, a lot of us don't know this, but we kind of avail of the sense of smell twice over. First by the kind of orthonasal smelling process and then the retronasal smelling process. Tell us something about the difference between orthonasal and retronasal smelling. What's that all about?
Oh, that is one of my most favorite topics because it shows how much we can be wrong about our own introspection of our own mind. Because what we usually call taste is actually smell. And we kind of know that if we have a cold, everything starts to taste bland, but we still don't think it's smell because we feel it's located in the mouth, a phenomenon called oral referral. And what's happening here is when you chew, the molecules, the aroma molecules are released and travel up through the back of your throat, up to your nose, up to that epithelium I mentioned. And it's basically the same molecules, whether you smell orthonasally or retronasally, and yet they are perceived differently. And this is why I like to say it's kind of two senses of smell. And you know that with, for instance, with coffee, smells awesome. Taste is a little bit disappointing, to be fair. I mean, nobody says wake up to the taste of coffee. It's actually the smell because it's kind of mainly bitter actually, which is a taste, but the aroma isn't so strong. You've got the opposite with cheese. You smell certain cheeses, especially let's say this very stinky French cheese, which you're even prevented from bringing to the underground, like to the public transport because it's so stinky. But when you taste it, I'm a fan of stinky cheese because there is a different quality, and one reason for that is purely physiology in terms of you have a different airflow, and that influences what molecules hit your receptors first, whether you breathe in, how the temperature is, versus if you've got the retronasal pathway where you've got air coming from your lungs transporting it up. So you have the same molecules, but the biology says, but I perceive this differently, which I find fascinating. And it tells us something about our consciousness. This is where the philosopher in me kicks in. One thing is, why do we perceive it, for instance, in the mouth and with other illusions, or however you want to call these kind of things? Because I don't think it's strictly an illusion. It's just that we mislocated something. The perception doesn't match the physiology. Well, one thing is, of course, the evolutionary explanation, the biological explanation. If you've got food, you want to spit it out where it's in, if it's toxic or anything else. And you want to be very, very fast in doing so, and not like, okay, it's smelling, no, I need to do a tasting. But the philosophical question, of course, is with orthonasal smell, we often lose it when it comes to, we habituate to certain smells. It's not constantly at the forefront of consciousness. While when you're eating something, you don't seem to habituate it in the same sense, but you're constantly aware of the flavor. So there's a difference when it comes to orthonasal consciousness. You smell, after a while, the smell is gone because you're like, okay, fine. I mean, you're not even smelling your home because you get used to it. But if you come back after holiday, you have this specific smell that only your house has, which is home, but you lose it after a couple of minutes. While with food, you're constantly aware of it. Why is orthonasal and retronasal smell, when it comes to the presence in your conscious mind, so different? And of course, with COVID, that kind of got a complete new dimension, because many people suddenly lost their sense of smell and realized just how important, how daily, like how much it influences of your daily perception in your daily life.
Yeah, that's right. Because, a lot of my patients patients of COVID who lost their sense of smell, and because we all know degustation is part kind of olfaction, part taste, and part kind of mouthfeel. The best description they were giving is that post-COVID, when they lost their sense of smell, they were kind of tasting something with their skull, which was a kind of funny description of what was happening. Yeah, I know. But tell me, in your book, you're kind of semantically almost resolutely against the element of subjectivity as regards smell, about whether things smell the same to all people. Now, that's a kind of demotic inquiry. It's not a philosophical inquiry, but do they smell the same to all people? Tell us something about qualia and the property of a percept that could be different for different people. It's the question of whether my blue is the same as your blue, or my rose is the same as your rose. But is it really? And is it important?
I love that you're bringing that up, because I rail against subjectivity, because that has been the reason that smell was often discarded. We like our theories of perception, our theories of the brain to be objective. But the question is, what does that mean? How do we define objectivity? And we define it based on a very, I almost say, pre-scientific view of the visual system. We see the same things, we can describe it in the same way. That doesn't seem to be the case with smell. We don't smell odors in the same way as other people sometimes. Plus, we often are not having the same descriptors of a smell. And so Shakespeare said a rose by any other name still smells as sweet. No, actually it doesn't. We're talking about 400 different molecules constantly floating around, and even a rose at a different time of the day, as any keen gardener knows, smells not the same, and actually also not as sweet. So this was often kind of used as, it's purely subjective. And I think this is a gloss over of what objectivity is really about. Because if we want to understand both ourselves as well as the way others perceive the world and what we have as a shared experience and as a shared world, it means to understand how we perceive, not what we perceive. So really to look at biology and psychology, and these differences or divergences we have often point us to the real commonalities. And the objectivity I see is embedded in our shared evolutionary history, the shared and also differences when it comes to cultural approaches to perception that shows what's the same, what's different. So we have a lot of variation, but variation is not the same as subjectivity. We often discard and dismiss variation because we think it's just subjective, it's just in the head. And this dismissal was often targeted, or smell was often targeted as that kind of thing. And that's why I rail against it, because one thing we do see is actually, well, a lot of the subjectivity, for instance, comes from genetic diversity, which is an objective thing to study. I mean, genetics is not some subjective whim. We just have to look at the complexities, at the intricacies, and that might tell us more. And it also might help us more to understand about the visual system. Just we study the visual system partly with pre-scientific ideas, and partly also in a way that a lot of things like visual illusions or certain visual seeming anomalies actually can be explained then by looking at the same mechanisms, genetics, for instance, as other senses. So I think it gives us a better understanding of what questions to ask.
So, you have this wonderful line in your text somewhere which says that we're all immersed in this invisible kind of multiverse of chemicals, which means that literally everything smells, but we don't smell a lot of it. Now, is it because we haven't kind of evolved the receptors for smelling all of it? So I'll just give you a point of reference, this little bogey that I would want to raise. LPG, liquid propane gas that we use for cooking. So many years ago, I was told that LPG doesn't have a smell. It's an odorless gas, but they put in kind of ethylene mercaptan or something like that, some substance, some odorant into it so that they can make it smell, so that we will know if it's leaking. All right. Now, it's strange because it's what you're trying to suggest that, and it is true that objects of sense exist only when they're perceived. Okay, but is it so that we haven't kind of evolved receptors for so many volatile substances that might be around us all the time? I mean, for instance, dogs, I'm told, have 40 times more of space in their brains to decipher smells. And for instance, they can make out the smell of pheromones from a female in heat, which is, 1 part in a trillion or something like that. Have we not evolved receptors for something like that? What seems to be the problem here?
So one thing is that not every molecule necessarily has a smell. So if we look at the table of olfactory elements, so to speak, it's technically, when it comes to features, chemical features, a little bit smaller than like what we can perceive, what chemicals, what chemical combinations. That being said, actually, we can smell a lot of things. As I mentioned, we've got 400 receptors in humans that can interact with, well, one of the estimates, for instance, there was a study a couple of years ago, says that, well, humans can distinguish up to 1 trillion different kinds of odor molecules, which is a gigantic number. That number is still disputed. So I think the official number is, excuse my French, shit tons. And it's like, we are actually not that bad at smelling. Just because there's some molecules we can't smell doesn't mean that we're necessarily bad. And the other thing is, not everything has an odor. So that's the other thing. It's actually quite hard sometimes to tell what molecules smell and what not, just by the structure and chemical features. There are some which we shouldn't smell, but we can't, and others where you would think, well, we should be able to smell them. So it's not a question of not having having evolved certain receptors, and it's also in comparison with dogs that we're necessarily worse off. When it comes to pheromones, for instance, there is a debate, like, well, can humans, for instance, smell pheromones or not? Well, the current status is no, and one of the reasons is that we lack the vomeronasal organ. It's kind of we have it still, like doing when you've got a child, a fetus, but it kind of it's vestigial, it goes back, and we don't have it as an adult. While, for instance, dogs and other animals do. And the interesting thing is that pheromones and odors are not the same. So there is something specific about pheromones, that you also have moths who can detect very, very minute traces, even in specific patterns, because it's never just, or it's seldom just like a trail of pheromones of a chemical, but it's often even like a pulse, like a Morse code that tells the animal, okay, this is my mate, and not just like a similar mate from another species. So there's a specificity when it comes to chemical communication, but it's not for human. It's mainly it's less about pheromones. We don't have that kind of species specific trigger. It's not that you've got a pheromone and suddenly your behavior is going in a certain way. It's much more about the measure and diversity of the chemical environment, which is constantly changing, and also the flexibility of responding to it. We use smells to respond as well. Smell is important for our behavior, but it's more about the flexibility. Actually, it would be harmful for us if we responded to the same molecule always in the same way in different contexts, and especially when it comes to food. Let's say, because many molecules are, you could say, promiscuous. You've got the same molecule coming from a variety of sources. My favorite example is indole, which, if you have it as an individual molecule, it smells like shit. It really has this strong fecal smell. Now, I'm going to ruin coffee for you. 3% of coffee are indole. We don't smell it. I mean, we wouldn't drink it if we smelled the indole coming through. Or jasmine, really ripe jasmine, which is one of my favorite flowers and flower smells, also about 3% indole. And we can detect it, but not necessarily as indole. So you don't smell, well, unless sometimes if it's overly ripe, you've got this kind of like, there's a bit of an off smell sometimes with very ripe jasmine, but otherwise you don't think, jasmine, it smells of shit. No, you think it's a beautiful flower. Versus when there was a study where they had people smelling synthetic jasmine without the indole and natural jasmine with the indole. People could tell the difference, like, okay, there is a difference. Like these are two different smells. Okay, same overall quality, but not the same. As well as they preferred the indole one. They didn't know it's the one that contains a contaminant, like a shitty smell, but they preferred it, which I think Freud would have a field day with. I mean, who knows what that means? So there are some interesting questions when it comes to ability. But that, bringing it back to your question, dogs have, well, every species has an own behavioral scope of what odors are relevant. And with us, for instance, well, at some point, certain things we don't smell because they might not have been relevant. Who knows? At some point, I mean, we notice this is relevant behaviorally, so we add certain smells to it that we can smell. And some things we can't smell because they're simply too big, molecules that are too big to interact with our receptors, or sometimes too small. So they're chemical features that sometimes prevent us or are not compatible with our biology.
But also, when you say that some chemicals needn't have a smell, it kind of reminds me of that analogy of, if a tree were to fall in a forest and there's no one, there, does it produce a sound? Because fundamentally, semantically, to a semanticist, what would be sound propagation would be propagation of sound waves through air. But you have to have an eardrum to kind of perceive it. So let's say if a chemical would produce volatile, if a molecule were to have some sort of volatile properties, but we do not have the receptors to smell it, can it be called an odorant, and can it be called an odor? Would be a moot question, And but yes, I mean, yeah. What do you have to say about that?
I love the comparison with the tree falling somewhere, and like, well, the comparison. I gotta say, I often, what a colleague of mine who works on smell, he has a distinct view on that. I'm still negotiating my own view, if I'm honest, because I sometimes think, well, it's maybe too neat. But so he's in London, Barry Smith, who does a lot on wine and aroma of wine, and he often says, well, there's a difference between the objectivity of what you're smelling. So there are certain chemical features, and the food industry makes sure that certain things do have a comparable tasting profile. I mean, think of Pringles, for instance, the chips or crisps. I mean, there's a certain odor profile, and food chemists are very good at finding a level at which people perceive the same thing in the same way. That being said, there is also kind of a variable expression in your brain through, like, in your perception through your brain. So there is both a certain variability and objectivity. And he likes to distinguish between perception, like how we perceive and what we perceive. And that's kind of, I think it makes sense, but it can be, of course, a cop-out with what you say. Well, hang on a second, but what if there is a certain way you could design as somebody potentially perceiving it and nobody perceives it, does it have a smell? As you actually said, I think this is asking a meaningless and wrong question, because it avoids what perception is about, and it is a biological expression of information. So no, it doesn't make a sound because there is no perceiver, or no, there is no olfactory expression because there is no organism that would perceive it. There is a disposition of it to be perceived, but that's something different.
Right. And you mentioned wine tasting, and there's this delightful vignette in your book on wine tasting and smell training, and what I was particularly affected by was the fact that you actually mentioned that you can physically bring about an increase in the thickness of the of brain matter if you are, smell training. That's remarkable. That's a, tell us more about that.
That was one of my favorite discoveries as well, because we're talking about 6 weeks sometimes, which is an incredible short time for the brain to change itself, so to speak, and shows again the cognitive dimension of smell. So there were a couple of studies, in particular one by Johannes Frasnelli in Montreal, he had amateurs, so naive smellers, people, not perfumers, not wine tasters, smell for 20 minutes each day, which is actually quite a lot of work, arrange smells according to intensity from low to high, or have a smell mixed into another, and arrange them, and train themselves by detecting, categorizing, which is a very cognitive task. And after 6 weeks, certain areas of the olfactory cortex actually really got thicker, which is striking. And that is one of the things that became, of course, now more prevalent, with the question of to what extent does smell training help you, if you lost your sense of smell, maybe to regain it? Because it's not just the receptors, you smell with your brain. And there are now a couple of places such as Absent and Fifth Sense in the UK, charities, who train people to regain their ability to smell. And some people do improve their sense of smell. So it's not just simply perfumers who learn something and thereby shaping their cortex, which is actually like any other skill. I mean, if you think of mathematicians, if you think of even somebody who does sports, of course, the cortical areas involved in a specific skill are going to change, and smell is no different. So it shows just how much perception is a skill, and how much what we think we can't do might be able to be altered, or at least refined.
No, I love how you describe wine tasting as a kind of cognitive exercise, and I'm reminded of this wonderful anecdote about this. Look, there are sommeliers, and there are other people who kind of pretend to be something to that effect, and there's got this sense of affected sophistication while they're doing this. And I'm reminded of this anecdote when this person who was clearly a fraud, and who wasn't quite sure that you're supposed to do this while sniffing it and rather than tasting it, decided to kind of swirl it properly, and then do a very cursory sniffing, and then tasted it, and was coming up with this fancy kind of handles. I'm getting myrtle, I'm getting honeysuckle, I'm getting raspberries, I'm getting melon. And while all of this was happening, a real kind of viticulturist was sitting there, and he proclaims with this very charming kind of imperious disdain, I actually prefer my wine to taste of grapes, you know.
Oh my goodness.
Which was great. And the other anecdote I heard about this was when people are kind of flailing for these descriptors, and this person who was trying to discern what kind of wine it is, and he gives it a swirl and he sniffs it, and he's trying to find the right word, says, I'm getting, and he says, I'm getting Brazilian woman, you know, which is which was the most
unusual descriptor. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, but yes, I loved the pics on wine tasting in your book. They were remarkable. Yeah.
That was from
yeah. I mean, have you trained yourself in the exercise, or?
I started to. It changed my mind. I really think wine tasting changes your mind if you really do it. I mean, you approach it from, as you say, well, you sometimes have people who throw around these descriptors, and they go, I smell a little bit of leather and a little bit of tobacco, and you think it's wine. I mean, really, it's red wine, it's white wine. That is how I approached wine tasting years ago. And then I had the luck actually to talk to wine tasters and sommeliers and winemakers. And I noticed, well, I was a little bit clumsy there. And there's one thing just to focus on the labels, because the descriptors sometimes sound so outlandish. Never get distracted by the descriptors. They're just cognitive handles of trying to pin down your perception on something you can deal with, that allows your mind to focus on something. But what really is happening is you've got some certain kinds of molecules that you also know from other contexts. Let's say you've got, sometimes people say certain parts of Riesling, like old Riesling, which is one of my favorite wines, there's kind of a petrol, like sometimes you've got petrol in there. And you think, well, nobody poured petrol in a Riesling, but you've got a molecule in there called TDN that has a smell that you otherwise in other contexts also know from petrol, for instance. So it is a way to, what I meant with the promiscuity of chemicals. They can occur in different contexts, and you can train yourself to identify individual notes within a complex mixture. That is a skill, because that's not so easy. Like, you smell wine and you've got this, I mean, you have hundreds of molecules. That's a humongous amount of data for your brain to process. And to go into, okay, this is that, takes training. It's similar to learning, for instance, a new language. You have to learn the vocabulary, the grammatical structure. In a way, that's also wine tasting. And language helps, and use language that's descriptive for you. But that's why sometimes it can sound so outlandish. I mean, there's this documentary from, I think, 2012, and I really recommend watching it. And there's this short scene, which I also describe in my book, which blew my mind. You've got this guy having this kind of white wine, and in 1 minute, and he talks faster than I do, in 1 minute, he identifies the wine, the year, the vineyard, what type of wine, everything. And you think, that's astounding. How can he do that? And then you have to look at what he does. So there is the video actually also online, and I really encourage watching that minute at least, because look at what he's doing. And a lot of things look pretentious, but it is deductive smelling. It's really a Sherlock Holmes way of forming a hypothesis, proving it, disproving it, and going by it step by step. And you see him first looking at the wine and holding it at this 45-degree angle. Looks elegant, sometimes pretentious, has actually a reason, because he looks at how the light breaks on the surface of the wine. And also when they go back and forth and they swirl it and they look at it, well, to what extent, how oily is it? How quickly do the kind of drops go down again? That helps you to form a hypothesis, not just whether it's white or red, but is there a yellowy film, for instance, over it? How does the light break? And so you've got the first classification in your mind, what it might be. Maybe it's this wine, maybe it's that wine. It's certainly not that wine. Then you swirl it. And what you have is you increase the surface so that you actually have a broader bouquet. because of course, as I mentioned, you've got the volatility of molecules that then kind of are released from that surface, and you allow molecules who are more or less volatile to come out. You smell it, you swirl it, you smell it, and you do it several times, because of course then your mind focuses on some notes, but you never perceive everything at once. Like sometimes you've got this conglomerate, but then you've got certain notes sticking out. And then you might smell them back and see, is that really what I think it is? Is it maybe more refined? What else could they be in there? And once, with many wines, you've got profiles. You've got descriptors in your head and you're looking for them. It's like a bloodhound. You really look for them. It's like, is this in there? No, it's not. That means it could be that one. My example again is Riesling, excuse me, where some people say, I don't detect a trace of oak. Well, why would they say that? Well, in Germany, for instance, you've got Riesling stored in oak barrels. In Australia, you've got them in aluminium barrels. So you already have a continent you can hone in. And so you do this again and again. And then, of course, the tasting comes, like how the acidity, the tannins, and different kind of features. And you go through the procedure, and the better, like the more you know, the quicker you get with certain things, like with any skills. And I found that so fascinating. And I try to do the same. I'm not an expert sommelier, far from it, because it takes sometimes a decade to get there. But I started doing that and I really got better. It was mind-blowing if you see these theoretical things happening in your own perception. And that helps you then to ask new questions. You know, when you have a wine and you're, I like that, let's say, blackberry note. And somebody goes like, yeah, but what about that vanilla note? And suddenly it's in your head. You haven't smelled it before, but suddenly it's there out of nowhere. How does the brain do that? And these things I find so fascinating. Because with vision, it's not that suddenly, well, you have it when it comes to, we think we see everything we do. Like, okay, there are certain things, but we're not actually seeing everything necessarily. Sometimes it takes somebody to point something out. So there's lots of subconscious processing, which we're not studying enough also in vision. So I'm not just simply bashing vision. I say, no, if we want to understand vision better, we got to look at olfaction. There are lots of things we think olfaction is weird, but we have the same in vision. We're just casting it aside because we're so enamored with what we directly perceive or what we think we perceive. I think we need to look at these kind of boundary cases. And wine tasting is perfect because it shows us so many things we think are impossible to do with our senses, with our sense of smell. We are much better than when we think we are.
So when I mentioned to my son that I'm going to be in conversation with someone who's written this wonderful book on smell, he had just one question, which is that why do we like the smell of our own farts and not the smell of other people's farts? You have to answer this.
Oh my goodness. I gotta say, you asked the best question, because there are people who study our perception of farts and what makes, things we always wanted to know. So first of all, the question is, of course, do we actually know what our own farts really are? Or is it just because we know they're our own farts? I mean, in the way of Austin Powers, everybody likes their own brand, which I think is the best description. I gotta be honest, my former mentor and I, we actually are playing with the thought of testing, maybe kind of in the direction of ignoble, whether people really recognize their own farts. They don't know whether it's theirs or not. So to what extent, I mean, some explanations why we like our own farts perhaps more is, well, partly because it is our own microbes that produce this stuff. So there is a form of, it is our own smell, and there's a familiarity with it. And you might even wonder to what extent knowing that it's our smell and knowing where it comes from makes a difference, rather than whether it's something else and could be just detected as something coming from the outside. So there's not an absolutely clear answer. That being said, I have another answer for your son he might find even better than the question of why do we like our own smell, namely, which farts are smellier, women or men's? Well, it turns out it's women's. Women's farts are much smellier than men's, but men's are more they have more volume. They pass more gas, but women's are a bit more concentrated. Let's put it that way. Really? So he might like that.
But it's just my sense is that I've tried to explain it to him by saying that it's the kind of evolutionary wisdom of disgust, in a sense that that what your effluvia is something that is exiting your body. Okay, so you're getting rid of your stuff. But when you're smelling something in, you're fundamentally possibly smelling a contaminant. So it's just the evolutionary wisdom of keeping away contaminants, which may or may not be true. But the idea is that, it's not just farts. I mean, I think there is this benign kind of masochism that we all exercise when we constantly indulge in smelling various smells that we produce. I mean, armpit smells or earwax or whatever. I mean, it's not that we're used to the smell of our own brew in the sense. We like the smell of our own brew. It's a kind of neurosis. We keep repeating this cringe. We're kind of pathetically needy in that sense. We need to smell our own selves. And possibly, I think I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but the evolutionary explanation for that would be, I don't know if it is to kind of figure out that all is well. It's a kind of check on our physiology, that everything is fine. Perhaps if something is off, we might be able to do it. I don't know if it's the human equivalent of the dog kind of licking his or her genitals, but it's a kind of constant feedback feedback mechanism that we might have to make sure that if our physiology is as it should be. What do you think about that?
Oh, I love that you bring that up because two things. You mentioned a couple of rich things. One thing is the nature of disgust, which certainly is closely tied to the question of smell. And what I find interesting is really the border between inside and outside, because certain things we aren't disgusted by, we can get disgusted by. Spit, for instance. Absolutely fine, but if we spit it out and put it into a drink, and then maybe an hour later somebody says, do you want to drink the clean drink or the one where you spit in? Well, you possibly would prefer the clean one. So as soon as it leaves our body, we develop a certain form of disgust. So I think there's definitely something here. Why I'm hesitant sometimes with going like how innate something is or how much it is like me and others is also that a lot of things with disgust are rather flexible. It is much more contextual and less hardwired than people like to think. And partly it's in the matter of how familiar we are with certain things rather than just, is it that molecule? Let's say one of the examples is cadaverine. Smells like it sounds, really smells of rotten flesh, but at a low enough concentration has a sickly sweet smell that some people find pleasant. So it really, really depends on context, on administration and all these kind of things. I think there's more things to be found out about.
In your book, you have a critique of the scent of Bard, of Proust, and about olfactory memory. And tell us about that, because you seem to suggest that it's running out of time. Yeah. Okay.
Can I say one last thing though?
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Because I love the Proust thing, and which brings me back to why I lost the track, because it was actually literature. What you said about our need to smell ourselves. I'm sorry that it sometimes it takes a second to kind of go back, but it reminded me of The Perfume by Patrick Süskind, where the protagonist realizes that he doesn't have an own smell, and he recognizes that in that cave where everything smells, but he doesn't have an own smell. So I think you pointed at something most fundamental, which we don't talk often about, because we like to especially think ourselves in terms of personality, mind, etc. But we are embodied creatures, and our own scent gives us a form of also self-assurance. You often see people when they're nervous holding their hands close to their nose, close to their face. I mean, which is now with COVID, of course, a big problem. And we're smelling ourselves. You see sometimes, especially people with long hair at some point, smelling their hair. It gives us almost a self-assurance of, we are here, you're present, you are yourself. And we also like to smell others. Like there was a study by Noam Sobel at the Weizmann Institute who had people shake hands with the experimenter, and unbeknownst to them, they was observed later, they started after a while to smell their hands, almost as if your hands are an extended tool for chemical recognition. So you are smelling others, not just, well, it would be kind of rude to just go up close to somebody and smell them, but we do smell them by touching them and then holding our hands to our nose. So I think you pointed at something extremely fundamental. We just like to kind of go for literature like Proust. And I think Proust is often misread because we say like, well, the Proustian effect, we've got memory and we smell something and suddenly we're back. But he actually, it's much more connected to motor control. He talks more about dipping the Madeleine than actually smelling and tasting it, because there's not a single descriptor of smell.
That's right.
is puzzling.
Well, in valediction, I must say that well, not just all the philosophical questions that you pose in the book, but also the quality of prose in your book is excellent. And even you have these throwaway lines, even in the introduction, which I remember one of them very clearly, where you say that perception does not mirror the world, it interprets it, which I think is the most lucidly philosophical statement you could make, or something that you say about stimulus being agnostic. I think, as I said, the marker of a great book is when it asks more questions than it can answer. And you've posed a sort of aggrandizement of the sense of smell, and this book has certainly managed to enlarge my curiosity about the sense of smell and the faculty that we pose. Thank you for writing this book, and I wish bestsellerdom upon this. How's the book doing?
I hope well. I gotta say it's doing well for being a first author book. But thank you so much for the kind words, because the writing and especially finding the right voice in the prose took years. I mean, I used to be a horrendous bad writer, and it took me years to hone it and to train it and to learn actually from better writers. So this actually means a lot. So thank you very much.
Great. And if I might just add that there's, I remember this quotation about philosophers and philosophy, which the only quotation that I remember, which is that the only thing that a philosopher can be relied upon to do is to contradict other philosophers. Have you managed to do that?
Oh yes, at least that I can say I did achieve. There are people who agree, there are people who disagree, but especially the philosophers will find things they might disagree with. But then again, for me, it's more about really posing the questions, as you say.
Right. Thank you, Anne. This was most delightful.
Thank you, A.S. Barwich and Ambarish Satwik, for unraveling the mysteries of smellosophy. That was truly fascinating. We thank our celebration partner, Diageo. Thank you all for watching and being the fabulous audience that you are. Our speaker books, as you possibly already know, are available on the online Amazon Festival bookstore. Do please tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021, and our social media handles are @JaipurLitFest. Jaipur Literature Festival 2021 is protected by Dettol.
He showed us that courage does not need the crutches of power, and that oppression cannot suppress the will of the truly awakened. Today, his legacy is inspiring a new breed of Indians whose strength, vision, and idealism is changing the face of India. Saluting this new Indian, the New Indian Express. It's new, it's Indian, it's Express.